Welcome to Crafting Federal Grant Budgets. I'm Cheryl Kester Thomas, your presenter. If this is your first GPA deep dive session, I know it's mine. How this works is we do this pre-recorded session to do the materials that we would normally do in a traditional presentation. And then we're going to have time set aside at the conference for in-person hands-on learning. And I'm going to talk about that some more at the end of the presentation. Also, GPA has agreed to schedule a virtual discussion online after the conference for those of you who aren't able to attend in person. So let's just jump into federal grant budgets. What are our learning objectives today? Our learning objectives today are to help you better understand federal budget categories. That may seem like a strange objective, but I think it's going to make sense in a few minutes to you. I'm going to offer you some best practices for documenting your budget numbers. If you're new to federal or state grant proposals, or you're new to multi-year programs, you might not have had to do this before, but so we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you a few links to some budget regulations, although it's not comprehensive. And then we're going to do just a little bit of preview, tell you what's coming in the deep dive session at the conference. Before we really dive in, I want to talk about kind of where we are and aren't going today. So what I'm not qualified to talk about, what we're not going to spend time talking about, are in-depth discussions of like special research grants like NSF or NIH. I don't have experience in that realm, and I want to be quite upfront about that. Programs. I spend most of my time in the program space, and I tend to, in my presentation, sometimes use program and project interchangeably. I do have some examples in the presentation and in the extra handouts about capital projects. But so hopefully in your brain, when you hear me say project or program, you're going to be able to make that switch in your head and know that generally I'm kind of treating them as the same. But capital programs, capital projects, and budgets for capital projects do have some extra layers of rules and regulations. So that's the main thing I want you to be aware of about capital. And then finally, the lower left, different agencies, different details. There is no one right way to do things. I want to be really clear about that. The things I'm going to show you today are the strategies that I've developed that work well for me with the type of grants I write to the type of agencies I write to. Every agency is different, and they have different cultures, and they have different expectations. So I want to be clear about that. What you're going to get today are general principles that then you're going to need to adapt for what works for you in your personal situation. Okay, great. So the budget is not just numbers. I tell you, I struggle to make it through my one required college math class, college algebra. I have 2 degrees in English, thought I would never use math again, and I spend so much time doing math. Thank goodness it's simple arithmetic and not algebra, right? But our grant budgets are more than just numbers. They really help tell the story. A good, strong grant budget helps tell the story of your grant proposal. It reinforces the concepts you've presented in the proposal. So it's integral to the proposal. Do not fall into temptation to leave it to last minute. What you may not know is that in some cases, grant reviewers might read your budget or your budget narrative first before they read your proposal. I've even served on some review panels where different reviewers read different parts of your proposal. So someone might read your budget independently of your project narrative. So always keep that in mind. And then in the best of all possible worlds, a strong, well-documented grant budget is going to guide project implementation upon grant award. You should have been a lot of notes in there about how you made decisions, what's going to happen in what year and why, and where you got these costs. And those things are going to help whoever is responsible for delivering on the grant, deliver that grant well. Okay. At the bottom line, all this grant budget is our best educated guess of what this project or program will cost. While most of the rest of today's presentation is going to be me trying to help you get the budget as right as possible and get as much information as possible up front. Don't get frozen. Don't freak out. Budgets are routinely modified post-award, and you have some discretion post-award within budget categories. The regulations allow that, and you can always ask your federal program officer. So what I'm going to show you today and is going to reflect those strategies where we've tried to maximize the grant funds available in certain years, knowing we are more than likely going to be ending up doing something different by the time we get to the 4th or 5th year of the grant. So I'm going to say that again. It's important to get the budget as right as we can when we submit it, but don't let that freeze you. It's not set in stone. budgets are routinely modified post-award. So if we were doing this in person or we were doing this live, I'd be asking you to put your answers to this question in the chat. But I do want you to be thinking about this answer while we're doing the rest of the presentation. And I also want you to be prepared to come to the deep dive to talk about this and other questions. What are some of your biggest federal grant budget challenges? Like, why did you come to this session? Is it just trying to get the information from the people, from the staff or your colleagues or your clients? Is it figuring out how to put your organization's budget into the federal budget categories? Is it working with HR or finance who may not understand federal budget categories or don't want to share salaries or fringe information with you? Is it how do I project future costs? How do I guard against inflation or cost increases in a multi-year budget? Is it just getting it routed for internal approval, or do you have other challenges? So think about those things. Think about what you want to learn today and jot down some things, especially if we don't cover it today. Mention it in grant zones. We can make sure we cover it in a deep dive at the conference. So this is my personal take on how federal and state budgets really are different often from foundation budgets. So I started my career working on foundation grants, but then moved into government grants, which is now my passion and my love. But some of the things that are different. They are often, although not always, multi-year. We're going to talk a little bit more about that because sometimes, even if the grant program for which you are applying or even the capital project, well, no, I think for a capital project, it probably wouldn't be this way. So for the grant program, if it's a 5-year program, you may be allowed or required only to submit the first year of the budget with your proposal, but we're going to talk about how you need to plan all the years. There's typically an annual ceiling by which I mean you can spend this much money per year. What's different about a lot of federal and state grants is sometimes there's a minimum. If your project is too small or your budget is too small, they don't even want you to bring the proposal to them. A lot of times, in fact, almost all of the time, government grants are on a reimbursement basis. This is a really important detail for you and your organization to understand if you're new to these grants. So if you're like me, you wrote those foundation grants, like I wrote for $2,000 for the scholarship fund at the college where I work to a foundation, typically how that works. Maybe if it was even $1 million to endow a program chair. Typically how that works is you get a letter from the foundation with a check saying, congratulations, here is your grant. Go forth and do wonderful things and send us a report at the end of the year. No, federal and state awards are congratulations, you have a grant. First, read all this fine print and sign these documents, and then you must spend the money in an approved way. You must collect documentation that demonstrates how you spent the money, and then you have to use probably some portal you've never used before to submit those expenses and request reimbursement. Now, all the information on how to do that is going to be in your grant award notice that you're going to get from the funder. But the important thing to remember is you don't get the money up front. So you're going to have to be able to cash flow your project activities or your capital project while you're waiting for reimbursement, even if you can get reimbursement monthly. So that's an important distinction. They may or may not require match. If there are matching funds required, they're going to be very clear about that in the application materials. They're going to tell you what percentage of the match and what counts as match. And we're going to talk more about match at the end. And keep in mind that if you are new to this world, there are also regulations around procurement. What is procurement? Procurement is purchasing, acquiring goods and services, and contracts. So with the foundation, even if you've got a foundation to give you a capital grant for building your building, that foundation more than likely did not have rules about what the workers who built that building had to be paid, or where, if you had to buy those materials built in the United States, and many, many other rules and regulations. So as soon as you move over into the capital space, there are specific rules and regulations. And as soon as you move into expenses beyond a certain financial threshold, there are rules about whether you have to get multiple price quotes, whether you have to go out to bid, etc. We're not going to do a deep dive into that today. I know just enough to be dangerous. And pretty much what I'm going to do is point you to resources and say, you need to know about this. Okay, before I scare you with the way I typically do a lot of my really super detailed program grants over 5 years, I'm going to show you a real world example of a federal grant. So again, today, we're talking about principles, best practices. Do this if you can. Do this if there's spaces allowed. Do this if you're not putting things into a portal with character limits. Do this if you're allowed to use tables. And if you're not, you're going to do other things. So I'm giving you an example straight out. This is actually an excerpt from the book that Karen and I wrote. We wrote 2 books. One is Writing to Win Federal Grants, a must need for your fundraising toolbox. That's the one behind me. The accompanying workbook had 4 complete federal proposals in it. One of them was this proposal that I wrote to the Federal Emergency Management Agency in their Assistance to Firefighters grant program. And then this is exactly right out of the workbook, even the little blue note on the side. This is what it said in the workbook. This was my entire budget narrative. This was the budget. We're going to spend $117,000 on these things. Now, of course, we've talked about what all those things are elsewhere in the project narrative, and we've defined all those acronyms. And there was a budget form where I had a little bit more space, so I was able to give the kind of detail that I like to give in my budgets, which you're going to see on some future slides, like what model number was I getting and what was the unit cost and things like that. But I wanted to show you that although most of the slides are going to come in the rest of the presentation, they're going to show a lot of complex stuff happening that can feel a little overwhelming. Sometimes it's just as simple as this, a few sentences and a few numbers. Really, really depends on what your funder is expecting. All right, so step 1 in doing strong grant budgets, it's just going to be planning. You're going to have to start planning just as soon as you can. A great grant budget is tied directly to the program design. There should be no surprises. I'm going to go back a couple slides here and give you some examples. Okay, so let's go back to the firefighter one. We're going to buy PPE, personal protective equipment. And in firefighter world, this is pre-COVID. That doesn't mean masks and hand sanitizer. This meant helmets, hoods, coats, pants, boots, and gloves that were rated to a certain rating for safety, right? This is not the first time my reader has heard about this in the budget. Okay, as I said earlier, the grant narrative has laid the groundwork for why these are the things we need to buy and why we need to buy the number that we need to buy because our department is a certain size. Does that make sense? So it's got to be tied directly to the program design. And when the reviewer gets to the budget, they should not find any surprises. Okay, the best practice is build your budget while you're designing the program. Don't give in to the temptation to wait until the last minute. And don't leave it to the finance people. And by that, I mean, especially if your organization is kind of new to federal, but you have a bigger organization, the finance team or whatever they're called at your organization may kind of be used to being in charge of that. And so you're right over here writing the pretty narrative and they're putting together the numbers for you. But when it comes time to doing a federal proposal, you're going to need to interact with them and you're going to need to interact with whatever they provide you. And you're probably going to have to change it so that it will fit the federal expectations. And there's some slides coming where I'm going to show you that. So that's about why you need to work closely with your accounting team or your finance team or your grants accounting team or whoever they are. But the reason why you don't leave the budget to the last, why you don't just design a fabulous program and then work on the budget is you are going to have a certain amount of money to spend every year. In fact, that is one difference. I hinted about that on that slide that said how are federal different from foundation. The other way that's a really important difference is either the foundation has told you how much to ask for, you can ask us for $50,000, or in my experience, most of the time, you're just kind of like, this feels like a good amount to ask for from them. Most federal NOFOs, most federal funding announcements will say, the maximum you can have in any 1 year, and they'll pick a number, $254,764. And you cannot go up. So year 1, year 2, year 3, that exact same number. Well, what happens if you design a wonderful program that everybody's super excited about, but by the time you realize what it's really going to cost to deliver that program, your budget is $400,000? It's not going to work. And now everyone's disappointed and you have to redo everything. So I strongly recommend that you ballpark your budget figures and you continue to refine your budget figures as you're working on the program design. Got some slides coming that are going to show you that. And then another thing that the grant professionals are great at doing is include every possible cost. So I'm going to give you some examples. What does it really cost at your organization to add a staff person? Well, let's say the staff person is grant funded. Do you have an office space for that person? Can your organization provide them furniture, or would furniture be an allowable cost from your funder? Not usually, but there might be exceptions. Does your organization have a policy that you don't buy computers with grant funds because your IT department wants to buy and control all the computers so they're all the same? So what will it cost to the grant? What cost for hiring this person need to go in the grant budget? And what cost are your organization going to have to be prepared to bear? Whether there's a required match or not, there's going to be some cost to your organization. Now, this is a really good one I want you to be thinking about because you're either about to come to the conference, you're at the conference, and I've got some more slides coming up where we talk specifically about conference travel costs. So if you're watching this as a recording, you might even pause this for a minute and just think, what really are all the costs of going to a conference? I mean, the big ones are easy, right? Like airfare, registration, meals, lodging. But there are other costs. I want you to think about what those are, and I'm going to give you some examples in some slides coming up. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say at the beginning planning stage, when you're talking about your project and when you're talking with the staff, like tell me what you want to do with the project, and they're telling you, well, we're going to deliver tutoring and blah, 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 blah. And then you start asking questions. Well, what do we need to make that happen? Oh, by the way, guys, the grant requires us to have a full-time project director. So I'm going to put that person down right here. And then they're going to tell you they want tutors. Oh, the tutors or the director is going to need a computer, et cetera, et cetera. So you're trying to get a ballpark on things as you guys are talking, always to kind of keep in mind, where are we in relation to the maximum we're allowed to spend? I put mileage in because I find that that's one thing that people often don't think about. It's also not relevant for a lot of grants, but two specific instances are it can be relevant for travel. So if someone has to drive to and from the airport, I had a client once that was like 4 hours away from the closest realistic airport. That was a pretty big mileage expense. I also frequently have program grants where services are being delivered in a very large service area, and program staff need to drive around all these multiple counties or these 2 states for years. And so you want to make sure you're going to capture those costs, because if you don't, your organization is going to be stuck with those. Because here's what happens with a federal grant budget that's not well planned. You have submitted the grant budget to the agency, you get the grant, you are now expected to achieve all those objectives with the money they've given you. It's not their fault if you forgot that you've got to pay somebody to drive 1,000 miles a month or however many miles, and you'll be expected to do that on your own. That's why it's really important to go in with your eyes wide open about what will this really cost us, right? Let's say that you have people working with children, underage children. Do you need specific insurance for that? Could be an allowable grant cost if it's not insurance that you already carry. Is there specific training? Is there mandated reporter training? A lot of those details you won't know unless you spend time talking to the experts, the subject matter experts who are delivering the program services. So this is a ballpark budget. I strongly recommend that you as the grant pro or the finance team, whoever kind of owns the budget at the beginning, keep what I call the internal budget. I want to be really clear that these detailed spreadsheets that you're going to see don't get turned into the feds, right? They are your notes, and that's what you use to guide implementation in the future. And it's what you use to answer the question when someone calls you into their office, happened to me, a year and a half after you wrote the grant and said, why did we say this was only going to cost XYZ? Or why are we only doing this? Well, you have the notes, right? So the internal budget is for your planning. I urge you, recommend, don't not do this. Create a budget for every grant year, even if you're only turning in the budget for year 1. You need to know what your costs are going to be for all grant years so you aren't surprised. Take lots of notes. I put the notes right in my spreadsheet whenever possible, so it's all together. I just take details, I take more notes and more details. In the grant budget that you're going to submit, your goal, my goal, is always to make those numbers as real as possible. What do I mean by that? Well, in my experience, funders, or more realistically, the person reviewing, scoring your grant, they can find round numbers to be suspicious. If I submitted a grant proposal that was all completely round numbers, like this internal budget, it would look like I just pulled numbers out of the air. So I'm going to talk to you about some strategies to make the numbers real, and then keep that copy. Why? Because you're going to use it to answer questions in the future. You're going to use it for if the federal program officer asks you to modify the budget, you have documentation for what you can and can't do, etc. Now, what are your strategies for documenting this budget planning process? Like I said to you, in my case, I put notes in a spreadsheet, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples coming up. Or what barriers do you encounter at this stage? So you've got the ballpark budget, you're starting to pull together your internal budget. Think about what barriers you encounter to doing that the way you need to do it. And then are there strategies you can employ to overcome those barriers? Like, do people at your organization need some education, or how can you share with them some best practices to help you be more successful? So step 2, you've got the ballpark figure. Now you've got to start categorizing your costs. And I said at the beginning that we're going to talk about federal budget categories and why. So federal budgets are almost always, and I'm always going to have that caveat, almost always, because every funder is different. Some of them use alternate forms, but the standard typical federal budget categories are these. And these are on 2 slides. Personnel, which is salaries and wage personnel, hourly personnel, part-time personnel, fringe benefits, travel, which you've already seen an example of travel, equipment, things that we tend to call equipment in layperson's terms, but federal rules are typically not equipment. So for it to qualify as equipment for a federal budget, a single item of it, no matter how many you're buying, each individual item must cost more than $10,000. There are important reasons for this, but one of them is as soon as an item goes into the category of equipment, more regulations attached to it about how you have to track it, how you have to report on it to the federal government, what you have to do with it when the grant is over. It's more burdensome. So it's typically advantageous for you to put as much of your budget into supplies as you can. There's another reason why you want to maximize supplies and minimize equipment, and that is when you're calculating indirect costs, you have to exclude equipment from that calculation. That's going to make more sense when we get to the slides on indirect costs. Supplies are anything less than $10,000 each. And if you're used to the $5,000 number, it's $10,000 now. That threshold went into effect in October 2024 under the revisions to the uniform guidance in April 24. So while we typically think of computers and monitors and even servers and routers as equipment, they're usually supply because they now have a useful life of only 3 to 4 years, if that. And it's very rare for any single computer to cost more than $5,000 or $10,000. Okay, so most technology now is a supply. Contractual, that's a different line, and lots of things go in there, but consultants, vendors, you could make the argument that if someone's a 1099 employee, they might go there. You might want to talk to your finance or HR team about that. Sometimes software contracts go there. Sometimes some of these things go into other. So I'm going to skip over construction for a minute and say both contractual and other. Oftentimes, the NOPO is going to have very specific rules, and they're going to tell you which costs go into contractual, which kinds of costs, which costs they want you to put in other. Are you putting cell phone contracts or long distance is the thing we used to have on our budgets? Where does it go? Construction is only if allowed. So sometimes there are capital grants that are just for capital projects. So the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation is going to give you a grant to improve water conservation. And you might be able to do construction, or you might be able to bury some pipe with that, okay? But there are also program grants, even some program grants that I work with in higher education that have a program service delivery component, but they're allowed to have like a renovation component. They can't build a brand new building, but they could remodel something, and that goes into construction. Then there's modified total direct costs, which we're going to talk about, and indirect costs. There are so many exclusions and exceptions to indirect costs. If you need to learn more about indirect costs, I highly recommend that you go to conference sessions specifically about that. This year in 2025, there's a fabulous pre-conference workshop on Wednesday on indirect costs by Karen Norris. I'm signed up for it because I always learn from her, and I would recommend that you attend that as well. All right, unexpected grant pro skill 49. Understand that 49 is a random number. I call this translating financials. This is one of those silent skills, those hidden skills that grant pros develop that no one understands what we do, right? Your organization's budgets and how you plan for budgets in your organization rarely fit nicely into federal budget categories. So for you to take a budget that works at your organization, that internal spreadsheet you've built that will drive things when you implement, is going to take sometimes internal education and negotiation, or just some note taking, like on the next slide, to transfer all that stuff into federal budget categories so it will work with the federal budget system and so that your federal reviewers will understand it. So a simple way to do that until you feel like you're really confident in your knowledge of these categories is just add a column to your spreadsheet. So I went back to that ballparking budget and showing you how it starts to look when we start getting some real numbers. So somebody said, yeah, I think when we hire project directors, it's about 55,000. So there I went to HR and they said, well, actually for a new hire of a level 5 director, step 3, whatever your system is, right? That salary for that, or that is 54,742. Now, you see my little question that I put in my spreadsheet because I don't know the answer yet. Does this include fringe or is this just the base salary? And etc. The tutors turned out to cost more than we thought because we have to pay them $12 an hour now. Actually, this is a pretty outdated budget. A lot of places with like livable wage rules, those are $17, $15 an hour. So we underestimated how much we had to pay our tutors. So I'm either going to have fewer tutors, work fewer hours, or I'm going to have to find some cost savings in another budget line. The computers came in a little higher than I thought because I went out and looked up these Dell and Sprons because that's what my IT department says we always buy or whatever. But does this include software? Does my organization have a license for whatever project we use, Microsoft Office or Google Suite, or am I going to need to budget for that? All those questions. I feel like a lot of what we do at the beginning is ask a lot of what if questions. Does this include this? Does this include that? Who pays for this? Who covers that? I also want to say that I do typically do exactly what you see here is I will go out and look up a model number of a computer and say something like this has a real price tag on it. Do I have to buy that exact computer when I get the grant? No, I do not, because that exact computer might not even be around anymore. But it shows a reviewer that I'm looking at a real thing and not just, oh, I can just walk into Walmart and buy a computer for $300. You can, but that might not meet your company's IT standards. It might not meet the technical standards of the program you need to deliver. So it's super common when we start putting in these real numbers to have some go up and some go down. Like I said, pay rates may take you off guard. HR is going to guide you. But to go back to the tech question, don't plan tech or even get quotes just by looking up the cost at a big box store. Check with your IT team first because they often have required minimum standards or required brands. So work with your IT people if you're buying any tech, okay? Step 3, now you've got to start putting in the details. So we've got our real numbers. We know what we need to do, buy, and hire to deliver our program. Now I've got to put detail behind that to show my grant reviewers my calculations. This is what's going to go in the budget narrative. So this is just a detail of how I typically plan out travel. Let's say I know I'm going to send 2 people to a conference. And technically the registration fee is not really a travel expense. I do have some clients that move it to other. I've put it in travel for years. But I think this example right here is a great one to give you because if you haven't gone out and researched the conference or conferences that they're most likely to attend and confirmed that registration is only $400, and you find out later that registration per person is really $700 or $800 or $900, you're already going to be off on your budget, right? So, but I break it down with this much detail: airfare, meals, how many people are going for how many days, how much per day, how many people are sleeping for how many nights, and sometimes they have meals for 4 days, but they're sleeping 3 nights. It all depends. Is there airport parking? Remember I said, think about all the real costs of traveling. Did you think about airport parking? Which can be really expensive in some markets. Did you think about Uber or the airport shuttle or the train or whatever they're going to ride or use when they get to their destination? Is there hotel parking? Is that included in the lodging rate? All of those things. So I tend to add on like this rental car / ground transport number at the end, parking costs, if they have to pay to park at the convention center. It just depends, right? And then also an example of a service area that required lots of driving. I mentioned that in an earlier slide, and that's one way that I document that. What's nice about having this level of detail in your notes, other than being able to go back post-award and remember why you did something, is it basically writes your budget narrative for you. If I have planned my budget this well, I can typically hand my spreadsheet off to someone else and say, you know how I like my budget narratives, turn this into a budget narrative. Okay. And just for kicks and grins, I'm showing you a more in-depth, like this is a real live internal planning budget that I used on a grant. It's just an excerpt of the equipment and supplies. The spreadsheet behind this 5-year proposal had 10 tabs because there were some construction remodeling costs. There were equipment costs that came from one department of the college. There were some other technology costs that came from the media department. There were furniture costs, and it was not like office furniture. It was like stuff to support the grant activities that was allowable. And then there were a bunch of personnel calculations. So, but I hope you can see, other than the fact that some of the characters got switched to funky looking characters, is there's notes in here, like what is happening with equipment in year 4? Oh, that's Studio G13. Look on this tab for the list. Why do we have equipment in year 3? Oh, that's sets. Look at the sets tab. And then a lot of the reason that I do the things, all the notes that you see in supplies is because we have to kind of juggle money around, right? Like everybody wants to buy everything in year 1, but you don't have enough money in year 1. So you're having to kind of spread some things out. You're negotiating with people like, can I buy part of your technology in year 2 and part in year 3? And that's why these notes are written the way they're written, to help us remember why things got split apart the way they did and kind of who gets what in what year. So I'm going to come back. I know it said handouts there. I'm going to come back to the handouts in a minute, the alternate handouts, but we're going to hit this other slide first, and then we're going to hit those. So you see all that detail, and you may be thinking, where does she get those numbers? How do I know that? Well, as much as possible, previous cost. So if somebody from that department went to their professional development conference last year, what did that cost? What does it cost them to offer tutoring, or what does it cost them to do whatever it is that you want to do? Really, really rely on your project staff. Like, what are the costs for this? What does your budget look like in the past? I regularly get price quotes. Of course, anything. I'm going to switch back here. All the, well, you don't see the construction on this tab, but there was construction. They had to go get quotes from contractors for that. What's it going to cost us to hang this light grid for the studio? Ask lots of questions, and I've already talked about that. Ask people like, well, what about this? What about that? How do you know that's enough? Depending on your organization, do you have to pay tax? Is shipping included, or is that a cost nobody thought about when they put these prices on? So I highly recommend that you use some kind of budget planning checklist. And I've given you one example in your handouts, and we're going to switch over to that right now. So you're going to get some supplemental handouts that go with this session. And the first item in the supplemental handouts is this budget planning checklist. This is a budget planning checklist I've used for years and years and years. It originated in higher education, and I started using it when I was working in higher education. So that's why some of the categories are the way they are. It's also kind of out of date, like people don't typically have to list facts and long distance anymore. It's more to give you an idea of how to plan for things, and it also gives you a little bit more definition of the kinds of things that go into federal budget categories. To be clear, this budget checklist is not organized by federal budget categories necessarily, although you'll see the parallels, right? So I would say take something like this, adapt it to your own internal use so that you have something that you're working from for every grant so you don't leave important things off, okay? And then I said I was going to come back to the slide. So I gave you the excerpt on the sample internal budget with the notes. This is not the exact same grant budget, but I was just on this one page is an entire 5-year super detailed, just so you see how I plan my budgets and the notes I take. It doesn't have all the tabs, but it has the details. It's just an example for you. You don't have to do anything with it. And if it freaks you out or is not your style, you never have to look at it again. All right. So use that planning checklist or something like it. A couple of other things, resources you can use when I say, how do you know what things cost? Well, the federal government every year publishes what they call per diem tables. And these are what are government employees allowed to be reimbursed for traveling and food and lodging costs. They're by state, by city, sometimes they're even by season in the city. You don't have to use these, but you can. You may have state rates or you may have internal organization rates. Like I have one client that's not allowed to use the IRS federal mileage rate. Now that's actually a separate page from this. I would just say Google 2025 IRS mileage rate. They are always required to use their state rate. But I regularly do this. If I know that the grant requires project directors to travel to Washington, D.C. for a grantees meeting, then I pull the per diem table and I say, and I pull the numbers, like what are they allowed to budget for lodging at that time of year, and what are they allowed to budget for food? So use it if you find it helpful. If you find it stressful, then don't use it. All right, I wanted to show you a couple of multi-year budgets, just how all that detail rolls up into the federal budget categories, because most of the time, what you submit on a federal budget form is basically just these numbers. It's an SF424A, or maybe it's an ED424, or some other form, or it's just a portal where you're typing in numbers. All that budget detail, all that spreadsheet stuff I showed you, that's your internal notes. You're turning in these budgets and these numbers in these categories. So what's interesting about this 5-year program budget is this is one that allows construction and it had equipment. My grants actually rarely have equipment. Also, indirect costs were not allowed on this grant program. That's why I have blacked out that row. So sometimes, even if you have an indirect cost rate, you are not allowed to use it. And this is one grant program on which you are not allowed to use it. Notice that the annual grant amount is capped. And I think you can look at that total cost line and you can guess how much the annual was, right? We were allowed to spend no more than 600,000. And no matter what I did, for whatever reason, I can't remember now, I couldn't find one more dollar to spend in year 2. Probably it was going to cause a rounding error or knock me over a dollar or something. So we came in $1 under budget in year 2. But what that means is, look at your personnel line. If people get raises every year, their salaries go up, which means their fringe benefits go up, because fringe benefits are always a percentage of salary, whatever your health insurance costs, whatever your retirement costs. If those numbers go up every year and your grant amount does not go up every year, then clearly you have to spend less on other things in other years. So that's one way that's why it's so important to plan your grant out for all the years. Okay, this is another multi-year 5-year budget. It's another program delivery budget. This is no equipment allowed and no construction allowed. Indirect costs were allowed, but they were capped at 8%, which is even less than the de minimis. Again, there was an annual cap of 270,375. And you don't have to understand what training stipends are or why they're in their budget. It's a unique line used by the U.S. Department of Education, not even for all of their grants. If you have to know about something like that, it's going to be in your NOFO. I just wanted to include this example to show one way that you have to extract some costs from your total costs before you can calculate your indirect costs. So I'm going to say that again. Indirect costs are typically calculated as a percentage of your total costs, but there are some things that can't be in that calculation. So in this case, we put training stipends below the line, as accountants would say. It's outside that calculation of total costs. There are other ways to do that, and have another slide later that show you that. Okay, if that's something that you're going to have to do, it's going to be in the regulations cited in your NOFO. I went many years working on federal grants and never had to encounter this situation. So, unexpected grant pro skill number 22, getting larger grants. What do I mean by that? I'm going to go back 2 slides. I'm going to go back to this year, this grant in which the budget for every year was allowed to be 600,000. Remember how I said everybody gets real excited about the grant and they all want to spend all their money in year 1? Well, what typically happens is it's very common that by the time you're thinking, because you're writing this a year or a year and a half ahead, by the time 5 or 6 years from now, it's really hard for people to think what else they're going to need, or like we've built the room or we've bought the technology, like we don't really need. And so a lot of my role is encouraging them to think of things that they are probably going to need. Something's going to wear out by year 5, or you're serving more students, so you need more of something else. And that's mainly a strategy to capture the grant funds in the grant budget. So we're approved for 600,000 in year 5 and not approved only for 250,000 in year 5. Because in the real world, there are going to be things that they need that they haven't thought of, or an unexpected circumstance will arise, and you want to preserve the right to have those funds. You can always turn them back if you don't spend them, but usually you can find a way to spend them. So that is an important role that the grant professional, as a grant consultant or an employee, you can help your organization understand to plan ahead and to plan for contingency. And but you also have to write a budget narrative that makes logical sense, right? That makes case. Now, to be clear, I'm not telling you to lie. I'm not telling you to make up stuff. I'm telling you to help them think creatively and realize that there will be some costs that they might not have thought about in the future. Okay. Step 4, Now you're going to write that budget narrative. What are the budget narratives? Budget narrative is what it sounds like. You are giving them the cost, and then you're explaining to the reviewer what those costs are. Very often your NOFA will have instructions that say you must explain in your budget narrative why costs are reasonable, why they are adequate, why they are necessary to achieve the grant objectives. I typically have some standard language that's not too long about that. And then most of my budget narratives are giving detailed calculations. And you want to provide detailed calculations on anything that's potentially confusing or that might look oddly out of line to someone. If you have a reviewer, like I'm signed up to be a reviewer this summer for a federal agency. I'm almost 60. If I didn't work in this field all the time and work with these budgets every year, and somebody turned in a budget and said it cost them $5,000 to send two people to a conference, I might be like, what? That's crazy. But if I see all that detail, which you're going to see on the next slide, it makes a lot more sense. And there are specific rules about what you have to say about consultants and subawards and subcontracts. And those are going to be in your NOFO and in the regulations. Sometimes you have to say how they're selected. You have to say what their qualifications are. You have to say if there's a daily rate, an hour, flat rate, an hourly rate. But always you're explaining why the costs are reasonable and necessary. I would describe anything that what I would be a big ticket item, anything potentially confusing. For example, that client I told you about that lived 4 hours from the airport and it was not a big airport. So sometimes for them to take a trip to a conference required them to drive to the community the airport was in, have an overnight stay because the flight was like 5 or 6 in the morning and it was a 4 hour drive. As long as you explain that in the budget narrative, reviewers are like, oh, okay, I get it. And then if there's match required, of course, your budget narrative needs to explain how you're going to get that match. Where is the match going to come from? So I want to be clear that how much detail you have to provide and what you say in your budget narrative can really vary from agency to agency. And sometimes you don't know what that agency or the reviewers for that agency expect to see until you've had a review and gotten your scores back. I'm going to show you a very different kind of budget with a lot less detail that includes round numbers and everything that got funded in some upcoming slides. So my recommendation here is if you are new to a funding program at a funding agency, always do your best to learn as much as you can about what I call the culture and expectations of that program and agency that you're writing to. Even just a quick question out on Grant Zone can help. I mean, you can say, hey, I'm not asking anybody to share their grant proposal with me, but I have questions about how detailed should my budget narrative be? Because the kind of budget narratives that I write to my funders may not be the kind of budget narrative you're expected to write to your funder. Okay, I just want to be really clear about that. So again, going back to that travel budget and thinking about all the costs, have I captured everything? Oh, wait, what about baggage fees? Did I roll that into my airfare or do I call it out separately? Is there mileage to the airport here? Are they using rideshare, public transit? What's really happening? Those are just some more questions as you think about planning. But we've landed on a number here, right? We're going to send two people to this conference for $2,965. This is how I write a budget narrative. I'm not going to read it to you. You can take this, you can look at it later. I tell them it's reasonable. I tell them how many people are going to what and why. And then I typically use language like such as, if they know, then I have them tell me, well, what's the conference you're most likely to go to? And I'll name one or two. But I want to say such as, in case they end up going to something else. I don't want a federal program officer to say that they're tied directly to that exact conference in that exact year. But getting a conference name lets me go look up that conference for this year or last year. Where was it held? How much was registration? How much was the hotel rates? All the things, right? I also explained to them that I base my lodging and meal cost on the per diem table for the right year. And I also explained that we've gotten our airfare by looking at our local airport. I have, for any grants, I don't actually have a lot of clients here in my home region of Northwest Arkansas, but we have a very expensive airport. So sometimes I just have to say airfares from this airport are typically higher than average because if people are used to living somewhere where there's a low cost carrier, they can experience sticker shock when they see what it costs for us to travel. All right, this is what a capital budget might look like. This would be your internal budget, your planning, right? And even then, there's some round numbers in here. You'll see those renovations are only 500,000. But I've got a construction budget here of 6,008,541. Usually on projects like this is the total project cost. And you are asking the federal government, maybe you're allowed to ask for 1.2 million. So in this case, you have to present the total project cost and tell them what's in it. You might have to tell them what portion of that their money will be spent on, or they may have restrictions saying you can only use our money on this part. And then you're probably going to be expected to write a narrative explaining where the rest of the money is going to come from. So this first sample budget narrative toward the capital project just talks about how to explain that the costs are reasonable and where they came from. Basically, how you got bids. Okay. So the goal for this is to demonstrate how you know the prices are reasonably accurate. And then you will have probably subsequent narrative that explains where the match is coming from or how you are confident you'll be able to get the match. So using that in an actual proposal, okay, so before we move on to the other capital projects, I'm going to say program grants. There's a full budget and full budget narrative for a program services proposal, like the ones I was showing you, the 5-year grants that are delivering services. There's a full one of those in, this is the book, but the workbook, the Writing to Win Federal Grants workbook has 4 federal proposals in it that our clients gave us written permission to share. So I can share it with you in the book because I have permission to do that, but I can't share it with you like in this presentation. So I've given you some excerpts in these slides. If you want to get the book, the whole thing's in the book. But in the handouts that we're going to switch back to now, I've got some more examples of more capital-like projects and projects that show match. And because I think they make a nice contrast to the really line item detail thing that I was showing you for the program grants. All right, well, before we move on to the capital grant options, I do want to go ahead and show you these program grant details that I mentioned to show you. As I said, a full one of these is in the book, but I'm able to give you these excerpts here. This sample budget narrative is similar to the program that was on the previous page in your handouts, but don't expect it to match because it's from 2 different grants. This shows the kind of detail I will typically put in one of my budget narratives for the type of grants that I write. And you'll see I've got some call outs here that say, I gave this level of detail for these mentors and these coaches because I thought it might be confusing why the numbers kept changing. So I'm telling them how many people are being paid in each year. So this is just a good example. I typically also break down the fringe rate whenever possible. When I talked earlier about you starting to work with HR and finance and maybe do some educating, the first few times you ask for they don't like it. They're going to tell you that there's not one rate. They're going to tell you that it's different for everyone. They're going to tell you that it depends on what kind of insurance people have, if they have dependents or not. Just keep reassuring them that you understand all of that. This just needs to be an average. And actually, usually the simplest way to find the average is if they look at your organization's budget and you say, our salaries line is this, and our insurance cost or whatever else is like retirement insurance, 403B, Social Security, payroll taxes. If they add those numbers up and they add up your salaries account and you take a percentage, it doesn't have to be perfect, but what you're trying to do here is capture for your organization what it really costs to employ someone so you don't get shortchanged. So you're covering all your internal costs. So as much as possible, I do try to break those out. I have multiple clients that have multiple fringe rates. So someone who's on salary at this organization, their fringe rate's 34%. Hourly part-time people, it's only 19%. Why? Because they might not be eligible for any benefits at all, or they might have to pay into state retirement and they have to pay Social Security and Medicare. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of those capital budget examples that I told you about. I want to be clear that this was a publicly available proposal, not one that I wrote, but I was applying to this program. So I was looking for examples, like, is my budget detailed enough? I was new to this agency, so I went to get samples to see what they expected. And I found, wow, the total budget for this grant is in table 1. It's 2 lines. That was pretty amazing. And it shows their matching funds. So I'm just going to leave this here. You can take it and look at it later. We can also spend more time with this during the deep dive. Okay. And just be aware that something that you're going to spend $250,000 on is going to fall under procurement rules. For grants like this, that is not a number that's out of line. That is that's a reasonable cost for what they're doing, but you're going to have to go under procurement policies. Now, since it's a city, they probably already have procurement policies or they have state procurement policies, so this won't be new to their purchasing department. Then this is their budget narrative that explains how they came up with wages. It's their style of doing things. It's not the way I do it, but I need you to see more than one way of doing things. Okay, so this is several pages. I put the whole budget and budget narrative in here for you. Starting on page 9, same thing, another one, publicly available funded proposal, not one that I prepared. But I've put some notes on it where I've said, this is a really good example of how they're telling you how they're going to come up with their required match. We've allocated this in our city budget. It comes from the Water Enterprise Fund, and we've got a resolution before the city council already approving it. Okay, that sounds like a firm commitment. That's way firmer than, well, we'll try to raise the money, right? Some programs, I don't remember how much match was required by this grant. It probably wouldn't have been 83%. It might have been 75%. This is one of those things where it's really important to try to learn about the culture of the organization. Sometimes the program officer can answer questions like this, and sometimes you need to talk to current grantees. Sometimes exceeding the required match amount gets you more points, either officially or like, oh, that looks good. So they like you better as an applicant. Sometimes it has no effect, and there may be no benefit to you as an applicant to go over the required match. Those are just little details that it can be really helpful to talk to people to find out. And I just have notes on here, like just be aware that procurement rules for something this high, they were going to pay $376,000 for design. They're going to have to give more detail about that somewhere, right? And then I did wonder if some things that were listed in construction, but they called them equipment, if post-award, sometimes the funder might say, just move this to another category, or with this agency, that might be acceptable and it might fit under construction. So I just kind of want you to walk away from today also realizing that you do the best you can on this budget, but it's very frequently negotiations after award where they're like, hey, move this around, or can you give us more information about this? We're not sure what this means. And that's perfectly normal. So don't freak out about that. Okay. And I have some notes in here that said, well, maybe they had to get more information in a review stage. And then the highlighted text on this page is another example for how you describe how you know the costs are reasonable, because they went out to bid process. And that they're going to go to bid. They're telling you here, we will follow federal procurement processes to get a qualified contractor to provide these services. So those are the supplemental handouts. And I hope that you find them useful in your work after today. So moving on. Kind of wrapping things up, bows and tape, like the details, the jots and tittles, right? So matching funds. What's the difference between match and leverage? Matching funds means you must contribute a certain percentage of resources to the grant budget. I want to be clear. Many federal and state grants do not require match. I actually don't usually work in the space for grants that require match. On the other hand, many federal and state grants do require match. And so again, if there's match required, it will be very clearly stated in the application materials. It'll be clearly stated on the grants webpage, homepage, etc. They're going to tell you you're required to have 10% or 25% or 1-to-1 match, whatever it is. And then you will have to make sure you have internal processes to accurately track, document, and verify that the matching funds were properly applied to grant expenditures. And you may have to return grant funds if upon audit, you can't verify that you have them. Matching funds often get listed on the budget form as applicant funds. Only put things on that budget form for applicant funds if you're required to do so, because the minute you put them there, they basically become federal. The government claims them, and then you have to track them and account for them the same way you have to track and account for all your grant funds. So your NOFA will have very clear rules and guidance on whether you need to include applicant funds or state or local funds with federal in the grant forms. And don't do that unless you have to. Leverage is a term we sometimes use, or sometimes we use the word commitment, institutional or organizational commitment. That's when we say, hey, everybody, we all know that it's not free for us to run a grant program. And these are the things that our organization is bringing to the table. For example, we're going to give everybody an office. We're going to supply all the office furniture. Everybody gets a professional development budget that we're not charging to the grant, whatever it is you can and do. Okay. We're going to buy t-shirts for the kids because we know it's not an allowed grant expenditure. Um, you don't have to put a dollar amount on it, but in some instances, demonstrating your leverage or your commitment shows that you have what they call skin in the game, right? Also, sometimes there's a whole section that you're required to write that says, tell us how you're supporting this. Tell us how you're not just taking the federal money and just, doing everything with our money. And sometimes it's just there to demonstrate that I like to talk about it. I try to find a place either in my budget narrative or my project narrative. If there is a cost that I think an average reviewer is going to know that this is expensive, and if I don't mention that we have it covered or how we're covering it because it's not in the grant budget, they might think we forgot about it and they might ding me on that. So one example is transportation. If you're offering an after school or out of school program to K-12 students or elementary students, because 12, high school students might be able to drive, but it's off-site, but you're not charging transportation to the grant, you might need a sentence or two explaining how you've got that covered, for example. Okay, that's leverage. So match. What qualifies as match? Well, that depends because every grant that requires match has different rules about what you're allowed to count toward match. Applicant cash is the gold standard. And that example you saw from those two municipalities where they have money in a particular fund from user fees or rates that they're going to apply toward the project, that's easy peasy for them. They already have the money. Sometimes, very rarely, but in that world of those two those two capital examples that I gave you that I said weren't written by me, pre-award expenses were allowed. The city invested in some engineering and some planning to get them to the point of this application. And that particular agency allows a look back period of, let's say, 6 months. 6 months prior to the deadline, if the city can demonstrate that they can count that toward their match. That's pretty rare, and there's going to be really clear language. I would never go in expecting to be able to account pre-award costs toward match because usually they're not allowed. Other grants or gifts, you get some state funds, you get donors, you get sponsors. We've had a city that got like state parks funding for their park, and they matched it with a community fundraiser, and the school gave them some money, and the pharmacy gave them some money. You can't use one federal grant to match another federal grant. And what makes that a little complicated is sometimes dollars that look like state dollars are actually really federal dollars that have come through the state. So you might have to, if you're planning on matching a federal grant with a state grant, it's just ask the people at the agency, is this allowed? Sometimes some funders allow you to meet all or part of your match with in kind. What does in kind mean? In kind is something that is not costing you brand new cash out of your pocket, but it has a dollar value that can be attributed to it. For example, the value of your staff time that they spent on the project. One of those two capital project narratives that I showed you in the alternate handouts was meeting, I think, almost all of their match with staff time. And they wrote a really clear, cohesive budget narrative to explain that. Space for the project. If you have to rent a space or you have to use a space that you normally charge, or maybe you are normally only open Mondays through Thursdays, but you're going to be open on Friday for grant activities, and that has cost, utility costs, security costs, janitorial costs, and you're not going to ask the grant to cover them. You can say, this is what it costs us to deliver this program. Like I think I've given furniture as an example before because often furniture is not allowed, but somebody has to have a desk and a chair if they're working on site, right? And then volunteers contributing labor can also be considered in kind. And if you go to this website at theindependentsector.org, every year they run a report that says this is actually the dollar value of, and I haven't looked at it in several years, but it's usually over $21 an hour. Like it's shockingly high. So those are some creative ways you can capture match that don't require you to necessarily pay cash out of your budget. So I'm going to go back now. This is an excerpt from one of those samples that I showed you in the handouts when I said the city of Vallejo was matching 100% with in kind with staff. And so they're explaining what the staff are going to be doing to support the grant activities. And again, they've got an official resolution in front of their city council committing to that match. Yep. So I kept saying we're going to talk about indirect costs. And I also said, if you need to learn more about indirect costs, you really need to take more workshops because I am not an expert. But this is a good intro. If you're just new to indirect costs, what do they mean? Why would I need to learn more about this? Anything that's not a direct cost, that sounds silly, right? If it's not a direct cost, it's an indirect cost. Indirect costs are usually things we would consider overhead. Utilities. If you hire people with the grant, HR staff are going to spend time posting those positions, screening applications, having interviews, onboarding your new staff, enrolling them into the benefits plan. You're not charging that to the grant. Your IT team is going to give them a password and a email account. You're not charging that to the grant. But for those that allow you to claim indirects, they're acknowledging that running a grant program costs you something, right? If you have never had a negotiated rate, then you can claim what's called the de minimis, which is you take 10 or 15%, depending on what that NOFO says. We're transitioning to 15, but not everybody's there yet. I want to be clear because I didn't understand this when I was new to federal grants. You can't go get a negotiated indirect cost rate until you have a grant. Okay, you will not get a negotiated rate until you've had your first grant award. So your very first grant award that allows indirects, because they don't all, keep that in mind, you'll claim the de minimis, and then you can, if you need to, submit a negotiation. Now, getting a negotiated rate can be expensive. And years ago, well, it's been 20 years now, 20 years ago when I worked at my university, we did the calculation and we realized at that point, if we weren't getting something like, I think it might have been as high as $3 or $6 million a year in federal grant funds, it wasn't worth it to us to go pay the accounting firm to try to come up with a negotiated indirect cost rate. So if your organization feels like it's at a point where you need to do that, then that's when you start going to those workshops with someone like Karen Norris, and you're going to talk to an accounting firm, not your regular accountants, not your tax preparers. This is a unique thing, and not everybody knows how to do it. And also I'd put it out on GrantSummit, like what have like organizations like us, colleges and universities are a different realm and they've got those rates locked down and they know how to do it. But if you're not a college or a university, then I would ask people on GrantSummit, like people who do what you do in your field, like was there a tipping point? At what point was it worth it to get an indirect rate? There might not be that many grants that you qualify for. So you might not have to do all this work. Okay. Some NOFOs don't allow indirects at all, or they cap them. So you may have a negotiated rate of 45%, but you can only claim 8 because that program is captured at 8. Regardless of whether you're capturing 8% or the de minimis of 15 or you're claiming your 45, the other really important detail you have to know is if the annual grant award is $600,000, that does not mean you get $600,000 plus your indirect costs. That means you get $600,000. And you've got to include your indirect costs. So you're going to reduce your direct expenditures, the things you're spending directly on delivering your program services, so that you can make room for the indirect costs. Now, I've already probably put my foot in it because that can be a very political and heated discussion within organizations. You've got organizations who say, we've got to capture these because we have actual costs to deliver these programs. And you've got program people saying, yes, but if you make me take all the indirect, I have less to spend on my program. And actually both positions are right, of course. It's not a fun position to be in, but there are best practices and standards that different types of organizations have adopted for how they come to those agreements. Okay, I'm just going to show you one example of how to calculate. Obviously, I have this little blue call-out box. You can look at one of Cheryl's 5-year grants and go, well, we know how much she was able to ask for this year. She was able to ask for $1 million every year. And so I got it as close as I could. We are 999 and something in every year. This particular applicant had an indirect cost rate of 26%. So they've called it out as a specific line item. So I want to just pause for a moment on this budget narrative and say, why are these outline letters here? These outline letters and the names in bold match exactly with the letters and the names on the federal budget form into which we're pasting our totals. So we've got our total direct charges. We were explaining them here. We've got our indirect charges, and we've attached our copy of our negotiated rate agreement. And then we've got our totals at the bottom, showing that we know how to calculate this properly. Now, remember earlier at the very beginning of this presentation, I said, sometimes You have to pull some things out of those totals. You cannot calculate indirect on everything. So I know we're getting a little into the weeds here. So feel free to fast forward over modified total direct costs and indirect costs if you don't want to learn about this. The term for this is modified total direct costs. Basically, what you need to know is some things have to be excluded from your totals before you apply the percentage. And I would just say follow this link to 2 CFR 200 for whatever the current rules are. What's out, what's in. Now, your funding agency might be more restrictive. What do I mean by that? I mean, the NOFO may tell you to take more things out of your total direct costs before calculating indirect cost. And if they're going to do that, they're going to be very clear in the funding notice. So they could be more restrictive than 2 CFR 200, which is the federal regulation that applies to everyone, but they're not going to be less restrictive. Whatever you do, follow your funding notice, your NOFO or your RFP. This is the definition right now that's currently posted, which means total direct cost includes these things. That's what's in the first paragraph. Modified total direct cost must exclude these other things, and that's what's in the yellow. So for example, equipment, if you're buying grant equipment, it comes out of indirect cost calculation. Capital expenditures, that's usually construction. And then other things that most of us won't have, tuition, admission, patient care, but subawards in excess of $50,000. So if you have a subaward, and if you have them, you know that you have them, and you know hopefully what to do. And if you don't have to worry about it. So this was just mainly to tell you there are resources online for you to go to for if it's your first time and you're calculating indirect costs. Just know you can't necessarily automatically apply 10% to your grant. Just go read the rules and make sure you don't need to take something out before you do the calculation. Okay, so here are some takeaways to wrap up. These are our recap. So kind of budgets from the ground up. Remember, create a working budget for all years of the grant and just take as many notes as you can. Trust me, the longer I've been doing this, the more notes I take, the more detailed my spreadsheets are because, I'm getting older. It's harder to remember things. I do lots of grants, lots of things happen. It may be a year and a half before the grant is awarded. And me specifically, I actually don't typically work much with grants post-award. I'm a pre-award person. I sometimes interact with people as a program evaluator, but not usually at the budget negotiation level. So as many notes as I can take that I can hand off to the person who has to run the grant helps them understand what the thinking was. Because a lot of times the person who's running the grant is someone who was hired after the grant was awarded with grant money. They're probably even new to the organization. They're new to the grant and they're new to the organization and they're told run this program. So the more detail you can give them, the more you can make their life easier. Organize your budget as soon as you can into those federal categories. And if you have to do some internal negotiation, like I put this here and I put this here, everybody understands why it's here, right? And then you put all the totals into the federal form, but your calculations and the line item detail go in your budget narrative. And then just one more reminder and one more link to some regulations. There are rules about matching funds. There are rules specifically about contracts, especially those exceeding 50,000. There are rules about indirect costs, and there are rules about procurement, purchasing. And those purchasing standards are linked here. Just a few things to watch out for. I call them kind of gotchas. Budgets exceeding the max. I'm surprised how many people don't understand that concept of you only get $600,000 to spend per year. And the other thing they don't understand is they think, oh, but if I only spend $400,000 in year one, that means I can spend $800,000 in year two, right? No, it does not. Any grant year can never go over the annual max. If you underspend, that's just money you have to turn back in. Also, if you put in a budget that's less than the minimum, they're going to kick you back out. I still struggle with math rounding errors. I use a lot of Excel and I do lots of formulas and lots of percentages of this and percentages of that. And it can eventually enter rounding errors. So that's why you don't want to wait until the last minute that you're submitting before you paste your totals into your form. Or I just check my math manually because if you add up the numbers, the digits, because I'm never turning in cents. Okay. I think I never said that on any slide. You're not turning in cents. You're turning in rounded whole dollars. So sometimes you have to tweak things a little. Don't forget to account for those cost increases in the out years. Don't forget that the budget needs to match the project narrative. And if you have something in the budget that you forgot to mention in the project narrative, go back and put it in. Make sure that you don't include a cost that's unallowable costs, or that you're not properly calculating modified total direct cost, or you've calculated your match or indirect incorrectly. Those are some mistakes that are easy to make. All right, so this deep dive thing that's new for all of us, what's coming up? What are we going to do? So in person at the conference, we're going to have time set aside for more discussion. I would love it if you would go back to that slide. It's probably about slide 3 or 4 where I said, what are some of your challenges? And if you could come with some specific questions, you can also bring up your questions before the conference in Grant Zone. I'm going to bring some case studies. So we're going to have probably about 30 minutes where you're broken up in small groups working with some actual documents. You're not going to have a calculator or anything. It's just asking you questions. Here's a budget and a budget narrative. Here's some questions. Some small group exercises. What's really excited though is GPA has also committed to allowing us to, a week after the conference, hosting a virtual discussion for those who couldn't attend the deep dive in person. Now, we're not going to be able to replicate all the small group exercises necessarily, although I am happy to share the case study questions with you, but it will allow us to kind of wrap up the discussion. So if there's more in-depth discussion that needs to happen, we're going to do that then. So I look forward to seeing you at the deep dive. I hope you found this session helpful, and I'll be seeing you soon. This is just a little bit more information. Feel free to reach out to me on email. Wanted to let you know I'm a GPA approved trainer, and that's a great program. If you teach workshops, you should work with GPA to find out how you can be one too. And there's information on the books. Thank you very much.